The first thing that I want to do is to respond to your analogy. Your analogy that God is like someone who is watching behind a window as people do things out in the world. This analogy reminds me of someone I used to know whose name was Harvey. And Harvey didn't have enough to do. Harvey used to sit in front of the window and watch people. Harvey lived very close to the church, and so one of the people Harvey liked to watch was me. And Harvey liked to keep track of who was coming into the church, and he would pump me for information. Why had they been there? What did they need? Were they getting a divorce? Was someone sick? He always wanted to know what was going on in people's lives. But it never seemed to me that he wanted to know for the purpose of helping them. He just wanted to know. He was just curious, nosy. I kind of started to think of him as Harvey the Peeper, even Harvey the Creepy Peeper. And I didn't even like to go visit him because I knew that he was going to, first of all, ask me about everything I knew about everyone he could see out his window. And second of all, that he was going to tell me a bunch of things about other people that I didn't really want to know. God is not someone who just sits in a window and watches the world go by and keeps track of who does what and who needs to apologize to who and what's going on in the world from a distance. God is someone who is intimately involved in the world. God's involvement in the world reminds me of something that happened once. My sons, James and Nate, were both younger, and mornings used to be really, really hard for us. For some reason, the boys could never remember to do what they were supposed to do. And I really was glad that Harvey didn't live anywhere within earshot of our house on weekday mornings because it was not pretty. I usually ended up yelling at them and saying, "Come on, I told you to do that 20 minutes ago." And they hadn't remembered, they'd gotten sidetracked, they were doing something else, and we were almost always late, and it was driving me crazy. And one morning, we were late once again, and my son Nate had forgotten to put his shoes on, even though I told him 20 minutes ago that we were going to be late if he didn't do it right then and there. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he started crying, and I started crying. And James was standing back watching all this. And it wasn't usually James' fault that we were late. He was a pretty responsible kid. It was usually that Nate had gotten sidetracked. James saw me yelling at Nate, Nate yelling back, Nate crying, and me crying. And James came over and he put his arms around me and around Nate, and we had a group hug. When I read the Gospels and see the way that Jesus interacts with people, Jesus doesn't stand back and watch to see what people are going to do and mark their response and wait 24 hours to see if they're going to apologize to the person they should apologize to. Jesus is right in there in the middle of it. And Jesus doesn't always keep people from making mistakes or doing things wrong. But the very moment that there is pain involved in the situation, Jesus is there. Why is God powerless to forgive people after they die? And when I think about that question, I think of a woman I knew named Margaret. And I never knew what I was going to get when I went to see Margaret because she had Alzheimer's. And half the time I would go and visit Margaret, and she would tell me a terrible story about something that had happened a long time ago. Her husband had been at war. It was World War II. She had had an affair with someone who was helping with their farm work. And she had become pregnant, and she had terminated the pregnancy because her husband was coming home and she didn't want to be caught having had this affair. She carried this secret in her heart for many, many years. It must have happened when she was in her 20s. She was in her 80s when I knew her. She had never confessed this to anyone until she started to realize she was going to die at some point. And then she began to tell me about it. And I told her she was forgiven. I told her Christ had come to save her. I told her God loved her and God is love. And she would believe it when I spoke with her, but remember she had Alzheimer's. And she never remembered she was forgiven. And so half the time when I came to visit her, she would confess again what she had done. And again, and again, and I would tell her she was forgiven, and I would give her communion, and I would talk with her and love her, and she would forget. Her brain wasn't working. The other half of the time I would go to visit her, and she would just be angry and mad, yelling at the nurses, yelling at the aides, yelling at me, yelling at God. And when Margaret died, I don't know which frame of mind she was in. Was she one who was at the point where she recognized that she had done things in her life that were damaging and that she wanted forgiveness? Or was she angry?